All right, welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us today for a presentation and discussion of the book Arthur Vandenberg, The Man in the Middle of the American Century. We are very pleased to have the author here, Hendrik Meijer, as well as my colleague, our man in the middle of these three chairs, Michael Barone. Michael wrote a review of the book for the Wall Street Journal, and so this seems like a good as an expert on the book, he seems like the right person to lead the conversation here. The plan is very simple. Mr. Meijer is going to speak for maybe 20, 25 minutes about the book, give an overview of Arthur Vandenberg's life and importance. After that, we're going to sit down, we're going to have a conversation, and we'll end with a Q&A. Today's event is organized in cooperation with the Netherland-America Foundation, a nonprofit organization that strives to improve the bilateral, strengthen and improve bilateral relationship between the Netherlands and the United States. What is the Dutch angle here? Well, Mr. Vandenberg is of Dutch descent, as you can tell from the very explicitly Dutch last name that he has, and so is Mr. Meijer. All right, well, with that.
Thank you, Stan, and good afternoon, everyone. And from the Netherlands-America Foundation standpoint, a little bit of clarification. Vandenberg was a Dutch name, but from one of the old New York Hudson River Valley Dutch, as opposed to the newer waves of immigration who populated the town that he and I were both born in, of Grand Rapids. But when his father opened a harness making shop there in the 1880s, it played very well to have that Dutch name. It's a real treat to be here, and as Stan said, I'll just take a few minutes to set the stage on who this character was. And brought along just a few slides to do that with. And most everyone may recognize the young man on the right. Gerald Ford was the 38th President of the United States. And in this picture, the freshman congressman is welcomed to Washington in 1949 by his role model, the senior senator from Michigan, the Arthur Vandenberg. But we all know the guy on the left. Who was the guy on the right? Vandenberg was born in Grand Rapids in 1884, son, as I mentioned, of a harness maker who nearly went broke when Arthur Vandenberg was 9 years old. Now, that was in 1893, the Panic of 1893, the most significant depression to hit before the Great Depression. Also happened in the administration of a Democratic president who was himself, as Michael knows much better than I would, a bit of an aberration in decades of Republican rule. And later on his deathbed, Vandenberg's father, Aaron, who blamed the administrations for policies for perhaps causing that Panic of 1893, is reputed to have said on his deathbed, "Son, promise me you'll always be a Republican." Now, we don't have confirmation of that, but Vandenberg lived up to that anyway. At the age of 9, he was a young entrepreneur. He was setting up a delivery business with some of his friends, carrying shoes from a factory in downtown Grand Rapids to the Union Station depot. He was also something of a prodigy in government studies. Now, he claimed that he'd been reading the congressional records since he was 14. Again, we have no evidence for this, but his first job out of the Grand Rapids Central High School in 1900 was working in a biscuit factory, and he was fired the day he left his desk to join a campaign parade for the charismatic young governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt, who'd come to town in the fall of 1900 as a Republican candidate for vice president on the ticket with William McKinley. He was fired, and he was also inspired. He found a job soon after that with as a reporter for the Grand Rapids Herald, which was the city's Republican daily. And he was a regular Republican in a city, a state, really a country that were mostly Republican at that time outside the South. And impossibly soon, just before he turned 22, he became editor of the Grand Rapids Herald. He was making a name for himself on the national stage well before he went to the Senate in 1928, when he was appointed upon the death of a Democrat, Woodbridge Ferris, who'd been, again, in an aberration, elected in the Bull Moose schism of the Republican Party back in 1912. And then was elected in his own right a few months later. Vandenberg fought for reservations to Senate approval of the American membership in the new League of Nations after World War I. This is as a newspaper editor writing editorials, trying to find a compromise between the supporters of President Woodrow Wilson, who refused to make any changes to the League covenant that he'd negotiated at the Palace of Versailles, and his opponents, led by Republican Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge, in fact, not only told Vandenberg that I don't know if you were the first to propose reservations. Obviously, other people were as well, and certainly there's a line of thought that Wilson was that Lodge was determined not to give Wilson a victory, no matter even if Wilson had been willing to compromise. But Lodge told Vandenberg, "I'm going to steal your line. Unshared idealism is a menace." And so here this young man is already influencing the national debate from his editor's chair. He went on in the 1920s. Not only did in 1920 he wrote speeches for presidential candidate Warren Harding, including his primary statement in opposition to Article 10 of the League of Nations, and he wrote 3 books inspired by his hero, Alexander Hamilton. None of which, of course, were bought and made into a major theatrical production. He was ahead of his time. But it's interesting that he was writing this at a time when, even though Harding was a fellow Midwestern newspaper editor and a member of his own party, I think even Vandenberg recognized that there was a second-rate quality to leadership then, and he's going back to the founding fathers and trying to recover the ingredients in the American exceptionalism. But so high were the expectations that awaited him when he arrived in the Senate in 1928 that he didn't wait long to make a name for himself. He was eager to work with the new president, Herbert Hoover, but Hoover, who had never held elective office, brilliant in many respects, lacked finesse, to say the least, in working with Congress, and then the stock market crash in 1929 doomed his presidency. Then Vandenberg tries to work with Franklin Roosevelt after Roosevelt's landslide victory in 1932. He's a savvy politician in a state that's starting to flirt with turning purple a little bit, and he's also ready in a time of national emergency to cooperate with the Democratic administration. So he supports some of the early New Deal remedies for a crippled economy. And he has one of his own, savings deposit insurance to protect small depositors and save the nation's banks. Hoover had fought him on this, and Roosevelt does too, but Vandenberg and they were buying the argument of the bigger banks that if they're all taxed to support the weaker banks, then the weak will pull down the strong. But it was a measure that Vandenberg could put together the votes in the Senate for and push through as part of the banking legislation, a new law to create the FDIC. Roosevelt, of course, comes to see the value of it, and much to Vandenberg's chagrin, is all too happy to claim credit for what may have been, and I've got some expert economists in this room, so I have to be careful with this, but certainly one of, if not the most successful of all New Deal legislation. But it was Vandenberg's brainchild. As the reach of federal power grew, however, Vandenberg tried to draw a good Republican distinction between being social-minded and socialistic, and he broke with Roosevelt over executive rulemaking that he regarded as too intrusive. And he was a real vigilante when he thought the New Deal was overstepping the Constitution and could not abide Roosevelt's attempt to tinker with the Supreme Court because it had rejected some of his laws. And the hardening of Vandenberg's opposition to Roosevelt was coinciding with world events that posed new dangers. And now we're in the mid-1930s, and with the rise of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, peace in Europe appeared to be in jeopardy, and the Japanese war cabinet was invading China. In the face of these threats, Vandenberg fell back on what was for him a first principle, a Hamiltonian tradition, American neutrality. Somebody was explaining to me that you can't really say that that Hamilton was unwilling to make any alliance because he might have happily made one at many stages with the British, but he was determined not to do it with the French. And that famous line from Washington's farewell address that Hamilton wrote about no entangling alliances, Vandenberg really took to heart. In September of 1939, however, debates about neutrality took on new urgency when German bombers filled the skies over Warsaw. And on a national radio hookup from a baseball field in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Vandenberg, who was leading the resistance to repealing the Neutrality Act and the arms embargo provision of the act that would have enabled Roosevelt to aid the Western democracies, declared, "This is not our war." And before it became our war with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Vandenberg led the band of isolationists, mostly Republicans, but some Democrats too, who fought Roosevelt every step of the way. They distrusted his every move, fearing that American boys would once again be pulled into another European war. They fought and lost the fight to keep the arms embargo of the 1937 Neutrality Act. They fought and lost a fight over the Lend-Lease proposal to give destroyers to the British Navy. In fact, Vandenberg talked about when that passed, he was thinking in apocalyptic terms of another cataclysmic war and said, I've witnessed the suicide of the Republic. A little bit hyperbolic, but he had a tendency to do that. And Roosevelt was their nemesis, and Arthur Vandenberg was the organizing spirit of that resistance, particularly after William Borah, his mentor in the Senate, died. In 1936, he had avoided Kansas Governor Alf Landon's attempt to draft him as his running mate, which of course was a smart move because FDR carried every state except Maine and Vermont. And in the run-up to 1940, he was viewed as a leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. In fact, in 1938, the FBI opened an office in Grand Rapids, which some of you may not have been to Grand Rapids, but it's not a likely place in still the last days of the Depression for the FBI to expand. But the agent there who was asked about his new assignment said he'd been sent to keep an eye on Arthur Vandenberg because Roosevelt viewed him as, at that time, as his most likely and formidable opponent. But Vandenberg and his isolationist colleague Robert Taft, who you see here, that were swept aside in 1940, along with their traditional isolationist view, by a charismatic lawyer named Wendell Willkie, whose willingness to intervene in Europe nearly matched Roosevelt. And as the war began to turn in the Allies' favor, and the Allies, of course, had been dubbed the United Nations by FDR, Republicans faced two big questions. One was partisan. Wendell Willkie was what we might call today a rhino. He had no party base. He was viewed by most of the GOP as an opportunistic interloper. Any comparisons with the present day will start to get a bit confusing. But his nomination reflected a deep schism in the party, one that's still with us today, between the isolationists or unilateralists and the internationalists or those who believe in broader global cooperation. And if the Republicans were going to have a chance at the presidency in 1944, these factions needed to come together. But how? The other question on the minds of the Americans of all political stripes, as the tide is beginning to turn midway through the war, is what will the world look like when the war ends, and what role should the United States play in it? Would we retreat again as we did after World War I? And then Vandenberg's editorials had faulted Wilson and the League of Nations. Now the question was whether and how nations might organize themselves to avoid future catastrophes. And there was a growing body of public opinion and concern. And Roosevelt wasn't sane. He wasn't letting Democrats in Congress tackle the subject either. People in Congress were inevitably and naturally responding to public concerns about what's going to happen when the fighting ends. And Roosevelt, quite properly, is Dr. Win the War at that stage, trying to keep a lid on a lot of this debate for fear that beginning to put any specifics around post-war plans may inevitably put off the Russians, who have their own designs on post-war spheres of influence, might put off the British, whose empire has been taken apart by the Axis powers and includes a number of colonies who are going to be seeking independence. And so Roosevelt wants to keep a lid on those discussions. And his focus was on winning the war. So to answer that first big question, the partisan one about Republican unity, the party called a meeting of their leaders, elected leaders, so that Willkie wasn't invited, to be held at the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island in Michigan over Labor Day weekend, 1943. And if you ever happen to find yourself in northern Michigan, it may be the longest porch in the world, and Vandenberg was chosen to chair a GOP foreign policy group to resolve this schism, or at least paper over it enough to have a platform to run on in 1944. And not for the first time, he looked for a middle way. In this case, between the isolationists, who wanted nothing more than to wash their hands of the world and bring the troops home, and many of whom were his longtime friends and allies, people like Robert Taft, people like Colonel McCormick at the Chicago Tribune, and the Willkie adherents, who held varying ideas of world federalism, an international police force, at the very least a revived League of Nations. Republicans came out of that meeting with a statement they could run on and an expression of support for some sort of world organization. And Vandenberg was so careful to hedge it about that it would in no way jeopardize American sovereignty, but it went beyond anything that Roosevelt or the Democrats had offered for the reasons I described earlier. And so the wonderfully ambiguous Mackinac Charter set the stage for things to come. When I succeeded in putting 49 prima donnas together, Vandenberg told Henry Luce of Time magazine, and it certainly took one to know one, I discovered the necessary formula. And for him, that was compromise, which for him also was almost an art form. He was moving away then and being nudged away by his own involvement in these things from isolationism. Pearl Harbor obviously played a part, but so did his nephew, Hoyt Vandenberg, an Air Force general and a student of modern warfare who had been in London for the Battle of Britain and would drop by Uncle Arthur's apartment on a Sunday afternoon to talk strategy in the kitchen. I mention this just for the salacious appeal of it, but Vandenberg's mistress, probably planted by British intelligence, probably had much less influence. She was there chiefly to report back, presumably, on what these isolationists were hatching to try to thwart Roosevelt's efforts to help the British. But the press responded enthusiastically to the Mackinac Charter, and suddenly Vandenberg found himself as the spokesman for a party that was all of a sudden taking the lead, just filling a vacuum to advance support for what would become the United Nations. And yet, even as he was moving in a new direction, it was chiefly behind the scenes. Most of the public still thought of him as the voice of isolationism. But that changed on January 10th, 1945. The Allies were winning the war, closing in on Japan, pushing across the Rhine into Germany. And a weary Roosevelt, in poorer health than anyone knew or let on at the time, was about to leave for the Russian resort of Yalta to meet with Stalin and Churchill to talk about what the collapse of the Third Reich, how to respond to in the wake of the impending collapse of the Third Reich. And Vandenberg was worried. Neither he nor his colleagues knew what the three leaders would be deciding or what deals FDR, for whom they had a profound mistrust, might commit to on our behalf. So Vandenberg rose in the Senate to announce a proposal, a post-war security treaty among the victorious Allies to ensure that Germany would never wage war again upon its neighbors. Boom. This was the leading isolationist calling for an American commitment to an entangling alliance with countries that had fought 2 world wars in the last 3 decades. It was, as one correspondent said, the speech heard round the world, and it was a renunciation of beliefs he had espoused for 25 years. Roosevelt spoke dismissively when he was asked about Vandenberg's speech, but the White House made a hasty request for 50 copies before the president departed for Russia. And within months, the world and Vandenberg's place in it changed very quickly. Roosevelt returned from Yalta knowing that he had no choice if he was to avoid Woodrow Wilson's fatal mistake with the League of Nations after the First World War, other than to appoint Vandenberg, Republican voice on foreign policy, as a delegate to the conference to be convened in May 1945 in San Francisco to create the United Nations. Then Roosevelt dies. Vice President Harry Truman had had lunch once with the president since the election. He was a neophyte in foreign affairs, although a decisive one, because he quickly announced that the UN meeting would move ahead the following month. And since Roosevelt had often worked around the State Department in crafting foreign policy, his new young Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, was also a marginal player. Vandenberg's Democratic counterpart on the delegation, Foreign Relations Chairman Tom Connally of Texas, was a canny old politician, but of somewhat limited range. And that left Vandenberg, the Republican who'd come around to speak out first in favor of such an organization, to emerge as the most influential American delegate. When it came time to sit down with the other powers in the penthouse of the Fairmont Hotel to design what Vandenberg liked to call the town meeting of the world, his opinion and that of the Soviet Foreign Secretary Molotov, who's not in this picture, although Andrei Gromyko, who we know as a longtime Russian ambassador would be the ones that seemed to count the most. He made sure the UN Charter allowed for regional security agreements so that with the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. and its Latin American neighbors could have a mutual defense treaty. And he made sure there'd be enough Republicans on board in the Senate to approve the Charter when it landed in their laps. And President Truman needed him. After the Charter was ratified, the President asked Vandenberg and Connally to play an unprecedented role in diplomacy. For starters, they were appointed as American delegates to the first UN General Assembly in London later in 1945. And this was before there was a UN ambassador, so these are the American spokespeople. And Vandenberg is there with his fellow delegate, Eleanor Roosevelt, with whom he also had a very testy relationship because he saw her as we talk about being socialistic, as the leftist on FDR's shoulder, and she had her own schemes that he was skeptical of, and one that I might mention was for a planned community in West Virginia whose cottage industry would be furniture making. And this is the senator from the furniture capital of the world who just did not take kindly to those kinds of schemes. And so after the UN meeting, but as after they sailed over together and they were together, Vandenberg wrote to one of his friends. Actually, I think he wrote to John Foster Dulles, and he said, I take back everything I've said about her, and it's been plenty. And she, in turn, writes him, begging him to stay on for the next General Assembly meeting, and he's saying, thank you, but I've got to get back to the Senate. So they actually ended up with sort of a mutual admiration society that's completely unexpected by their earlier career. But more significantly, Vandenberg and Connally joined the new Secretary of State, their fellow former Senator James Burns, for conferences with foreign ministers in Paris through much of 1946 to negotiate peace treaties with countries such as Italy and Austria that had fought the war on the German side. 1946 was also the year that Look magazine published a profile of Vandenberg, and in the story are a couple of paragraphs that I wanted to share that kind of suggest his influence. Every few months, wrote Look, several million people become grateful to Vandenberg for expressing their vague thoughts, such as, what is Russia up to? He was the master politician in his ability to be flexible and I think principled at the same time, and he had the credibility that went with being the reformed sinner. He'd always wanted to write a biography of St. Paul, as a matter of fact, although Vandenberg's political conversion was a little more drawn out than that. But the senator had become something of an oracle. It might take a whirling dervish to follow the pros and cons of Vandenberg's Senate votes over the past 18 years, Look reported. But Vandenberg has whirled as the American people have whirled, or as one of his fellow senators put it, Van changes his mind about as often as the average American, but slightly earlier. And I love that line because I think there's a little bit of an understated hint of genius there, slightly earlier. He was no visionary, and he's not so far out in front that he doesn't have followers, but he could express the shape and the temper of the times. He was a fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and the Emerson essay Self-Reliance says, Speak what you now think in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. So as a politician, he was ready to change and willing when the time was right. And he was bringing millions of anxious Americans who, like him, had been isolationists, not wanting to get involved in the war before World War II, bringing them along with him as they're testing the waters of what becomes a new world order. And that made a big difference when Truman asked for support of the Truman Doctrine, calling for the U.S. to help nations threatened by totalitarian, read communist subversion. And more specifically, he was supporting Truman when the president asked Americans to pick up the baton from the impoverished British and aid the governments of Greece and Turkey against communist pressure. And this is Truman's presenting the Truman Doctrine to a joint session of Congress with Vandenberg on the dais. He was at that time, there was no vice president, and he was president pro tem of the Senate. It made all the difference when Secretary of State George Marshall proposed an unprecedented aid program to help the European democracies rebuild their economies. And Truman had the political sense to call this the Marshall Plan after the revered general. Marshall himself said it could have been called the Vandenberg Plan because he reflected when it went to Congress, Van was just the whole show. And he was the center of attention at the Republican convention in Philadelphia in 1948 when it looked like whoever ran would beat Harry Truman. Here he is with Hazel, his wife, in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. He did not campaign, however, and Thomas Dewey, who was wonderfully organized and vastly more ambitious for this office, became the nominee. Meanwhile, Americans were learning that rebuilding the European economies was not enough. There was also the power vacuum left by the war and now being filled in Eastern Europe by the Red Army. The war-wrecked democracies formed a European Union for mutual defense and invited Americans to join. And now this was the big one, an entangling alliance which Vandenberg had once so resisted. The Vandenberg Resolution, a one-page document he typed out himself, enabled American entry into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it sailed through Congress with Vandenberg's leadership. And these bipartisan majorities for the UN, the Marshall Plan, NATO, were his pride and joy. They began to fray about the time he was diagnosed in 1949 with lung cancer. After fighting fellow Republicans in the House to secure funding for NATO military aid, he was flown to Ann Arbor, Michigan for an operation that removed half of his left lung. And as Mao and the communists emerged victorious in China, Vandenberg was headed back to the house he'd built as a young editor in 1907. And as he lay dying, he cherished the chatty notes he'd received from General Marshall, who reminisced about the days when Marshall's undersecretary, Robert Lovett, had paid regular after-hours calls on the Vandenberg apartment to flesh out NATO and other significant initiatives. It would have been a great relaxer to sit down and have a drink with you and Bob Lovett and decide just how we were going to manage the world and then have done it, Marshall wrote. And Vandenberg replied, "Those were truly great days. Looking backward, it is really quite amazing how well we and the world got along together." But times were already changing. Not only had bipartisanship suffered amid recriminations over who lost China, but a young Republican senator from Wisconsin named McCarthy was fomenting fear with wild exaggerations of communists in the Democratic administration. And then in 1948 election, the Democrats recovered the majority again, so there was less need to reach out to the Republicans. And war had broken out in Korea. The bipartisan bonds were coming apart, and Vandenberg was not there to patch them up. And that brings us full circle to Michigan. And as broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow told his radio audience the week of Vandenberg's death in April 1951, "We are now divided, bitterly, hysterically. Had he lived, he would have gloried in this conflict and steadied it, and he would have been confident that at the end of the day, the little men of loud voice and small faith will yield to the collective judgment of the American people." And I hope that gives you just a little bit of an introduction to this character. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michael, do you want to?
Well, thanks very much, Hank, for an inspiring presentation and getting me teared up towards the end there. As as a one-time constituent of Senator Vandenberg's, although I didn't realize it at the time, as far as I know. One of the things that I derive from your book is that Vandenberg, in these negotiations during the last couple of years of the Roosevelt administration, the Truman term, Vandenberg reserved the right to disagree with the administration, but didn't exercise it. But clearly, he was putting in a kind of veto and shaping policy in, and one of the characteristics that he seemed to have brought to that was a firm anti-communist feeling, which was not shared by all the people around Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. It's not shared by Henry Wallace, vice president before Truman, not necessarily shared by Secretary Burns. He uses the term Iron Curtain months before Churchill's famous speech in Fulton, Missouri. What are the roots of his anti-communism, and did he play a part in setting up the basically anti-communist Cold War policy? Would it have happened without him that way?
I don't want to say something wouldn't have happened, but you were right, he had been a critic of communism from the get-go as a I would say, just as an aside, but maybe affecting that. The only time that Americans and Russians were ever in combat together was right at the end of World War I, when Wilson bowed to pressure from the British and French and sent an expeditionary force to northern Russia, ostensibly to keep arms that we had sent to the Russians from falling into German hands after the revolution, and Lenin pulls the Russians out of the war. But they were really there to destabilize the Bolsheviks. And many of those soldiers, most of them were from Michigan and Wisconsin. And Vandenberg, as an editor, is aware of and working editorially to get their remains returned from a country with whom we had no diplomatic relations. So even at that level, there's a bit of visceral antagonism. But he had opposed diplomatic recognition right along, and was strongly anti-communist. And then toward the end of the war, of course, the Russians were our allies, helping defeat Hitler at great sacrifice to them, and in popular thought, every effort was made for them to be our noble, friendly allies. And so even as, and Wendell Willkie is flying around the world at Franklin Roosevelt's behest and writing not only about global federalism, but also about the wonderful character of the Russians. And so there's a popular sense that they're still our allies. When Vandenberg is sitting down, I mean, the war is still raging when they sit down in San Francisco at the United Nations, and he's facing off with Molotov, beginning to argue about what's going to happen. And
it wasn't a friendly relationship.
No, it was. Well, and to your earlier point, he never seemed to buy into that sense that, I mean, he had a huge ego, but Roosevelt, Truman, Burns, they all had in common that sense that we can negotiate with Uncle Joe. And I don't think Vandenberg ever bought that. And then when he's sitting down with Molotov, he's realizing these guys are tough customers that we're going to have real problems with once this war ends. So that United Nations delegation is getting an early taste of the kind of antagonisms that are going to become public later.
And this segues into his helping to form the Marshall Plan, NATO.
And certainly the Truman Doctrine was an early expression of that, and then hard on its heels comes the Marshall Plan, and it's easier for Vandenberg to buy into it when he realizes that there is a dimension to that is going to be anti-communist.
And that plays into NATO. Early in the book, you talk about Vandenberg as an editor and his enthusiasm for the character Babbitt. which is widely taken, the 1922 novel by Sinclair Lewis, which is widely taken as a debunking of the Midwestern values. And he has another reaction and then an interchange with the author.
Well, this was one of the fun things working on the book, and if you're going to spend that much time with a character, you appreciate that they have a lot of dimensions to them. And so in another Midwesterner, Sinclair Lewis, publishes his second novel, actually the same year that Vandenberg wrote that book about Hamilton that I showed up there in the early 1920s. And it is, it's called Babbitt, and it is essentially a very sardonic portrait of this middle-brow, middle-class, Midwestern striver, George Babbitt, who is from a town called Zenith, which I think Lewis had Cincinnati in mind, but it could easily have been Grand Rapids. And he is held up to a certain level of mockery. And then H.L. Mencken and other social critics pick up that term Babbitt and use it, as you say, to deride these bourgeois Midwestern values. And Lewis never actually quite went that far. Lewis was a bit more of a closet conservative, but that term, Vandenberg takes offense at these characterizations of the mid-sized city Midwesterner who loves his service clubs and his cigars and maybe worships Teddy Roosevelt. And so Vandenberg writes an editorial that says, let's save the best of Babbitt, talking about how he cared about his town, his family, his community, and there were things there to cherish, not to deride. And then, and he finishes that editorial that says, spare me the company of the Menckenses and the Lewises. And this is in early 1920s. And then in 1935, Arthur and Hazel Vandenberg are on vacation in England, and the Sinclair Lewis has married the preeminent female correspondent of the age, Dorothy Thompson. And Dorothy happens to be a friend of Hazel Vandenberg's, and she has been in Europe getting interviews with Hitler and Mussolini and actually becoming perhaps the first major, giving the first major warnings about how dire the prospects are of Hitler's rise. And she's gone back to file her stories, and Sinclair Lewis had stayed on in England for a couple of days and happens to be on the same ship returning with the Vandenbergs, and sends a note to the Vandenbergs saying, would you like to meet and have a drink? And the story that we get from Hazel is that Arthur wasn't too keen to do that, but Hazel says, well, the guy won a Nobel Prize, and he's married to Dorothy, our friend, so we ought to at least get together with him. And they end up, she also says SL tight, which was not an unusual characterization because Mencken was grievously alcoholic. Lewis, I'm sorry, yeah. But over the course of that week-long cruise, they really bond. And Lewis had, before he left, had submitted his novel that was published soon after they returned called It Can't Happen Here, which some of you may have run across, imagining a Huey Long type figure being elected president the following year in 1936. Of course, Long's assassination removed that possibility, but on the very first page of that book, it says that the character who was elected defeated Franklin Roosevelt, Arthur Vandenberg, and a couple of other people. And what I love about this also is not only did the Vandenbergs and Lewises become friends, but Lewis, before he met Vandenberg, the protagonist in Can't Happen Here is a small-town newspaper editor who I think Vandenberg might have related to a little bit. But when this fascist regime of this populist figure takes over, rebellion breaks out. And where does it break out? It breaks out in Michigan between Sault Ste. Marie and Detroit, which is quite a wide arc, led by a bulky, placid senator named Walter Trowbridge. And Dorothy Thompson insists, and others have too, that Arthur Vandenberg was. Dorothy Thompson said it was Arthur Vandenberg and George Norris were Lewis's two models, the progressive senator from Nebraska. But Vandenberg and Lewis, the Vandenbergs host a book party for Lewis in the future in Washington, and Lewis writes Vandenberg a letter saying, you should be running for president, and it turns out to be a very amicable friendship.
What about Vandenberg was editor, wrote multiple books, hundreds of thousands of words, maybe millions. Tell us about his prose style.
Well, it's easy to say it was purple. Sometimes Hazel, who actually had been a bit of a journalist in her own right, she'd helped write an advice to the Lovelorn column for the Chicago Tribune before they were married. Would help edit down some of it, but if this guy ever met an adjective he didn't like, you couldn't tell. It's hard to read some of his stuff.
But you did.
Oh yes.
Man.
It made it a reasonably distinctive style when there were unsigned editorials and you're trying to figure out who wrote them.
Tell us how you became involved in writing this book. You are executive chairman of the Myers Company, very successful business, and if you don't, my Michigan relatives don't say I'm going to the supermarket, they say I'm going to Myers.
Well, and thank them for that.
And you can buy everything at Myers, too.
Well, I had done
how did this happen, and where'd you find the time?
Well, the cheap answer to that is it took me 25 years, which is also true. But I'd written a biography of my grandfather who started our family business, and it was published regionally, and really loved the biography form and had always been interested in international relations and foreign policy, and so curious about this guy, Arthur Vandenberg. I mean, I would read other people's accounts of the post-war period or the history of American foreign policy, and his name would pop up. But if you walked down the street in Grand Rapids and said, who's Arthur Vandenberg 20 years ago, they would say, well, is he related to the jewelry store? Because there was a jewelry store by that name, which he wasn't. And he had been forgotten. In fact, it's small ironies, but the new federal building was going to be named for, in the 1970s, was going to be named for Arthur Vandenberg. But then when Jerry Ford became vice president, his friends in Congress said, oh no, we've got to save that in the Michigan delegation, we've got to name it for Jerry. And then the main square in town was going to be Vandenberg Center in the urban renewal years. It still is, but nobody calls it that because it has a major Alexander Calder stabile, so it's now Calder Plaza. This guy couldn't catch a break historically. And so and
there was no major biography.
There was none, and so I was thinking about writing about him, but there had been a fellow who turned his dissertation into the first of what he had hoped would be 2 volumes on Vandenberg. It was published in 1970, and it took Vandenberg up to 1945, which of course is when the really good stuff starts. And he became a professor in Chicago, and I assumed that he'd be working on that, and the world didn't need 2 biographies of this guy. And so I had a friend who was an historian in Grand Rapids who in 1989 was putting together the program for that year's annual meeting of the State Historical Society. And for those of you who've been to something like this, you have a couple of keynoters and then you have a dozen breakout sessions on different topics. And my friend was trying to fill out his program. And he said, well, you're interested in Vandenberg. You don't have to write the whole book. Just, talk about something and I can put it on my program. And so I did just a brief presentation and turned it into an article on the debate over the repeal of the arms embargo in 1939. 6 people showed up, I think, for that talk. But this is in October of 1989. January of 1990, I get a call from the daughter of this professor in Chicago, the adult daughter. And he'd had a very difficult life, both emotionally and medically, and had died. And she was closing up his house in Wilmette and getting ready to sell it, and she didn't know what to do with all of his research on Arthur Vandenberg. Now, this is 1990. This is before everything is digitized, nothing, before there's something online. And so this is all Xerox copies of papers from Truman Library, Roosevelt Library, British Foreign Office, a lot of different sources, as well as other research, correspondence, things he'd done over the years. And it had no monetary value, but she hated to throw her father's life's research away. And so she calls the Historical Society of Michigan and says, do you know anybody who has any interest in Arthur Vandenberg? I had spoken at their conference. I was the only name they had, so they gave her my phone number, and I ended up bringing a van load of papers back to Grand Rapids. And you go from thinking the world doesn't need two biographies to thinking, well, if I don't do it, who will? And having a real sense of mission. And that really, and working independently without research assistance or anything like that, or sabbaticals, this saved me weeks of work going through. I mean, I've been to the Truman Library, I've been to the Roosevelt Library, but this really did a lot of the legwork for me, allowed me to concentrate on Vandenberg's papers, which are at the University of Michigan, and on interviewing people who still remembered him and had worked with him as young assistants or family members.
You were writing 40 years or more after his death, 40 to 60 some years after his death. Can you tell us some things about some of the people that knew him, whom you did have a chance to interview, some of whom probably no longer with us?
Most of whom are no longer with us. Well, his youngest daughter, who was his only survivor, he had a son and two daughters. His son had been his chief aide for many years. He had one daughter who was alive at that time in the 90s, and she lived in Connecticut, and we became fairly close. And the family had given his papers to the University of Michigan, which included both Arthur and Hazel kept scrapbooks meticulously. They clipped out anything that referred to them and put them in the scrapbooks. They're a great resource.
This is before Facebook and Instagram.
Oh yeah. This is Sunday afternoon relaxation, and for example, I mentioned his affair with this woman who as an old correspondent, I think it was Walter Trohan from the Chicago Tribune, said, well, of course they planted, her name was Mitzi Sims. They planted Mitzi Sims on Vandenberg just like Kay Summersby on Ike, and just as matter of course, we all know this, but his daughter denied that he'd really had an affair. She was kind of trying to keep it platonic, and then finally, as we got to know each other, she gave me a couple of pages out of the scrapbook that had not been given to the university, that had a picture of Mitzi Sims from the Society column, and talking about how her luscious curves and her sultry voice, and Hazel has written "ha ha" next to it, and then things like I talked to William Fulbright, who again, many of you have heard this, but when Vandenberg chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, when Truman becomes president, there is no vice president, and a lot of people, including many Democrats, weren't sure if Truman could swing it. He was an untested senator without a particularly distinguished background, and Fulbright, although a Democrat, and Vandenberg were very much in sync on foreign policy, and Fulbright actually had the temerity to suggest that Truman appoint Vandenberg Secretary of State, which would put him next in line of succession under the old rules, and then resign, making Vandenberg president, and which Harry Truman, of course, ever after said, "This is Senator Halfbright talking." And, but I interviewed him when he was about 88 years old at Hartson and Hogan law firm, and he's trying to remember an anecdote, and he finally leans back in his chair and he said, "You waited too long to talk to me." Which, of course, no, I didn't. I just got to you. I just started on this project. But you got very mixed. I don't know if I would have liked the guy if I'd known him, because he could be a real arrogant cuss. But the older newspaper people who got close to him loved him, and I think he, a little bit like Sam Rayburn, had the what did he call that when some of the legislators would join him in his Board of Education? Yes, Vandenberg would say schools in session, and had half a dozen reporters who were close to him who would he would hold forth with, and they loved him. But if you were a young reporter trying to get your first interview, he wouldn't give you the time of day. And you came away saying, what an arrogant jerk this guy is. So there's a real disparity there. But no, I interviewed Gore Vidal because Gore Vidal had met him taking his blind grandfather senator around to various political functions and had taken him to a Republican convention. And of course, Gore Vidal, progressive leftist as he was, came around to sort of a Robert Taft approach to foreign policy. And so he saw Vandenberg as being co-opted by the Truman administration and being basically carrying the water for the Democrats, where, as you were saying earlier, Vandenberg always reserved the right to dissent. Now, he had to do that to maintain his credibility with his fellow Republicans. If he had to be careful because he's working with the Democrats. I mean, he's helping give Truman some pretty big diplomatic victories. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of Republicans. And so he always had to say, well, that's because, if it was legislation, I've put my stamp on it. And Dean Acheson would deride him and say, we send these great proposals up to Capitol Hill and Vandenberg has to just tweak him. It's his own ego talking, which in part it was, but it was in part because Vandenberg knew what it took to get it through the Senate. And he could go to his Republican colleagues and say, I've made these changes, guys, it's okay.
And he would, in negotiations with administration people, he would also say, I think you say that that's not going to fly in the Senate.
Right.
We can't do that because, and they seem to have taken his word for it.
I think they recognized they needed him. This is a time when you're trying to get 2/3 majorities, and
when presidents actually submitted treaties as treaties.
Exactly.
Under the Constitution.
Well, when the Senate had enough stature to be able to not let him get away with as many executive actions, probably.
So, yeah, Acheson in his book President to Creation takes a sort of, as you suggested, kind of a pat the old guy on the head sort of approach to Vandenberg. We Yale people know so much better, or something like that. How justified was that in your view after you've researched all this? And
I have to be careful. I'm not too biased about that because if many of you have probably read President of the Creation, it is an absolutely brilliant account of those post-war years. Easily the best, and Acheson was brilliant, but Acheson put himself at the center of it. And so not only does he condescend to Vandenberg, but he kind of condescends a little bit to George Marshall, too. He reveres Marshall, but the famous moment with the Truman Doctrine when Truman calls in congressional leaders and Marshall is describing the need to take the place of the British in helping the Greeks and perhaps the Turks resist communist encirclement. In Acheson's account, he says, Marshall finished and, didn't really seem to be very effective in getting his point across. And so, I said, well, can anyone chime in? And in Acheson's account, it's Acheson's persuasiveness that carries the day with congressional leaders. And actually, one of the people I interviewed was Clark Clifford, and it was a week before he was indicted. Otherwise, I don't think he would have been available after that. But he said, well, one of Truman's great gifts was that he was willing to step aside and let these big egos, and he mentioned Acheson and Vandenberg, wrangle over stuff. And so I think while Acheson was so gifted in so many ways, I think that he underestimated how important Vandenberg's legislative engineering was to getting the job done. And in fact, when Acheson then succeeds Marshall as Secretary of State, and Vandenberg kind of laments this because he's had such a great relationship with Marshall, and he and Acheson have been a little testier, but he puts word, he writes a statement of, and Acheson, who has so recently been ridiculed or been attacked by Republicans for not being more critical of Alger Hiss because of his relationship with Alger's brother, Vandenberg writes a statement for Atchison, which Atchison then gives out to the press unedited, declaring his commitment to freedom and his hostility to the Soviet Union. So, and again, Vandenberg saw that as necessary to help Atchison get confirmed. So,
you mentioned Alger Hiss. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Alger Hiss served as a staffer on the Nye Committee to stop the munitions makers from leading us into another war, of which you describe Senator Vandenberg as an active and enthusiastic member. And of course, Hiss was present at the Yalta Conference and in preparation for the UN meeting at the Fairmont in San Francisco.
That's right.
What did Vandenberg think of Alger Hiss, and how did he get involved?
He got along fine. I mean, I corresponded, just got a letter from Hiss because I wrote him, and he actually was, first of all, as such an ardent New Dealer, he went on this, so Vandenberg and Gerald Nye come together, and it's to the Nye Committee to investigate the origins of who's to blame for getting us into World War I. This didn't turn out so well. And in the mid-1930s, and as you mentioned, Hiss, who had been in the Agriculture Department, was added to the staff of this temporary committee, and he said, Vandenberg seemed very open-minded and very thoughtful in his questions, and he was generally laudatory, and I think Vandenberg reciprocated. I don't have his quotes about Hiss, but he does. But then Hiss is in San Francisco, and he's one of the functionaries helping run the conference, and Vandenberg's, we really had no idea that this guy was an agent. And so he, but then when it blows up, when it becomes apparent that there's reason to be suspicious of Hiss, that's when he makes sure that Atchison proclaims his commitment to the right way of thinking.
And so he doesn't get involved with Richard Nixon. Questioning.
Nope, he wasn't a part of that.
Of course, he was spending much of those years, 46, 47, out of the country.
Right.
And so forth.
I have to say, speaking of Clark Clifford, when I mentioned Mitzi Sims, Vandenberg's mistress to Clark Clifford, who was, I think, something of a rake himself, and he said, Mitzi Sims. I always wanted to meet her, but I never did. And this is what, 50 years later. It was just precious.
Have you preserved all these?
I don't have it on tape.
You don't have it on tape.
Just notes.
But it's still there. Vandenberg is a domestic politician. He came from Michigan, from his newspaper editorship, which he gets 5 days before he turns 22. And through the 1920s, a very Republican state, although occasionally going Democratic. Then it's the fastest growing state in the country in that period, north of Florida, east of the Rockies. Auto industry. Detroit is a big boom town, and it's a different sort of place from Grand Rapids. Vandenberg becomes the only big state Republican senator reelected in 1934.
Right.
When the New Deal is highly popular, Democrats have Republicans are down to fewer than 100 members of the House of Representatives.
And something like 17 senators.
How did he navigate Michigan politics, industrial politics, the rise of the labor unions and the United Auto Workers in the sit-down strikes of 1936-37? This was a turbulent state. Obviously, deposit insurance was perhaps inspired because the Detroit banks closed.
Directly inspired. When the Detroit had a banking crisis that was a precursor, actually Detroit and Louisiana, because Huey Long's involved in Louisiana, but it was the first big city whose the banks, there were two big holding companies that controlled most of the banking in the town, and they were the depression, the banking crisis hit them first in the country, and this is during the Hoover administration. And Vandenberg starts out as the home state senator, along with James Couzens, who had been running Ford Motor Company before he split with Henry Ford, but was, after Ford, one of the wealthiest, maybe the second wealthiest person in Michigan. They are working with Hoover's Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon and with Hoover trying to figure out how to save these banks. And this is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation had started under Hoover, and they're trying to get them to loan money to the banks to shore them up. And the banks don't have enough assets to meet the hurdle that the RFC wants to put on. And so there's all this negotiation going on, and Henry Ford's the biggest investor in one of the holding companies, but they can't get him to put in more money because he and Couzens can't stand each other. And
this is, I mean, I looked at one of the things about Couzens. He invests $2,500 at Henry Ford in 1903, and he sells out in 1918 for $30 million. You know, Silicon Valley.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. But anyway, they can't make it happen under Hoover, and then Roosevelt comes in, and they're still and I mean they negotiate with Ford, and they finally manage to make it to rescue those banks, or they're trying to, and then Roosevelt won't get involved until he takes office. As soon as he does, then Roosevelt declares a bank holiday nationally.
And how does so this is one of the ways that Vandenberg is addressing a particular Michigan problem and industrial city.
Absolutely, but to your wider point, he wasn't involved much in state affairs. He did get some support from, I guess it would be the craft unions as opposed to the new UAW. And so he was not without, he was just progressive enough in the early New Deal to pick up some labor support. And, but he doesn't approve of the sit-down strikes, but he also kind of stays away from it. He's off to other things at that point.
So before we turn to audience questions, I'm going to ask a couple questions too, using my mic here. The first thing I want to ask is about economic policy. In 1930, of course, famously, Hoover signs a large number of new tariffs into law. Henry Ford was a strong opponent of those tariffs. Vandenberg was, of course, an isolationist at the time, to at least to some extent. Today's isolationists are very pro-tariff in a way. Where did Vandenberg stand there, and to what extent was it just the position of the new automobile industry that he defended? To what extent was it?
He was not a free trader. He was traditionally one of those Republicans who, at that time, the prevailing Republican position was tariffs, but he was in favor. He had been when he first went to the Senate. He was always trying to build bridges here, and the Republicans were split between an old guard, generally more East Coast, Hoover was kind of an unknown quantity. I mean, he was a brilliant engineer, a capable administrator, but had never been elected to anything. And so he comes into office, and nobody's quite sure of where he stands ideologically. And the old guard senators don't trust him where he's going. The Western progressives view him as a businessman who might be too close to Wall Street. And Vandenberg is trying to get them to work together to support Hoover's policies. And one of the things Hoover was looking for was more executive flexibility in tariff negotiations. And Vandenberg was trying to help him with that. He wasn't opposed to tariffs, but he wanted a little more executive flexibility that would keep some of the really onerous tariffs that might happen from happening. And Vandenberg can't get the two parts of the party to work together on that, and so he falls in line with all the other politicians trying to do the tariffs that help your hometown, your home state. So Grand Rapids was a center of flypaper production, and he fights for a flypaper tariff, and all the petty stuff that is the worst parts of that system.
That's how you get 20,000 different tariffs, right?
That's right. Yep.
The other thing, and this is much later in life, on the foreign policy side, you briefly mentioned Vandenberg's nephew, Hoyt Vandenberg, who went on to become the second CIA director. in the book, you don't get the sense that the two Vandenbergs are particularly close professional allies. How can you talk a little bit about their relationship?
And I guess I don't get at that because I don't have much evidence of that because they were very cautious. So Hoyt Vandenberg grew up, he was Arthur's nephew, grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but after high school came to live with Arthur. Arthur's first wife had just died, so he was also becoming a bit of a nanny at the time for a year, but he came to live with Arthur so that he could get appointed to West Point by the owner of the Grand Rapids Herald, Senator William Alden Smith. And so Vandenberg gets Hoyt into West Point that way, and then Hoyt is this dashing young aviator in the Army Air Corps, rising quickly through the ranks, and then Vandenberg goes to the Senate, and Hoyt emerges just before World War II as an Air Force general. But at this point, Vandenberg and Roosevelt are so hostile that neither Arthur nor Hoyt wants to be very public in their relationship because Vandenberg is one of Roosevelt's bitterest enemies, and this could not have a healthy effect on Hoyt's career. But at the same time, Hoyt is in, I mentioned that earlier, he becomes really a student of modern war strategy as an aviator and a general of the Air Force. I think he commanded the 9th Air Force in England during World War II. But when he's in Washington, he is coming over to the Wardman Towers on Connecticut Avenue, and on a Sunday afternoon he comes over with his wife and kids, and the rest of the family's in the living room, and Hoyt and Uncle Arthur are in the kitchen. And there was no question that they were talking a lot. And then Hoyt, you mentioned the second director of the CIA. This was in 1946. And George Kennan and Vandenberg never had much, if any, direct contact. There's no evidence of that. And Vandenberg was a sort of politician that Kennan despised because he would be, didn't just swallow whole whatever Kennan's beautiful missive talked about. But when Kennan, I think it happened more than once, when he quits the State Department in disgust, Hoyt Vandenberg at the CIA hires him for a couple of months to come and be his consultant at the CIA in the summer of 1946. So I have to believe that there was a lot of interesting interaction there about which I have no evidence at all. So I couldn't go anywhere with it.
The problem when people talk instead of writing each other letters. Okay, well, let's take questions from the audience. We're going to start all the way in the back. Please wait for a mic, and then briefly introduce yourself. The mic is coming. Yeah, you're the. Hopefully, I think.
No.
No. Please briefly introduce yourself, and then let's try to keep questions question length, not essay length. Let's try to make sure to end in a question mark.
Okay.
I think it's a great question because I think his answer would have been, but I don't know how, well, I don't think at that time he would have had the vision to say that this rivalry with the Soviet Union is going to end anytime soon. And so I don't think he was looking over a horizon to imagine the collapse of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, he would have said, and in fact insisted upon it in some of the language around in selling NATO and some of the language around some of these projects, that ultimately they ought to come under the umbrella of the UN, that we ought not to be hanging out there forever with these security treaties, because if the UN ever actually lives up to its potential, then they should be unnecessary. And he used that as a selling point. Did he ever believe it would happen? That's a different question that I don't feel qualified to answer. But I think he wouldn't have seen NATO, for example, being finite because soon the Soviet threat will go away. He would have hoped that it would become finite because this UN structure would provide other sorts of guarantees so that NATO wouldn't be necessary.
Let's go to the middle here, third row.
Greg Rose, having recently reread Atchison's memoir, and I know, as having worked for the majority leader in the Senate, one of the former majority leaders, I follow closely Atchison's discussion of what he was doing with Congress. And before he was Secretary of State, he basically was an assistant secretary in charge of congressional affairs. And so my question is two different things. One is specifically regarding NATO. Atchison is simultaneously sort of contemptuous of the Senate, but also he works well with them in some sense, because he knows how important it is. So what can you say about, and specifically NATO? It seems even from Atchison's account that Vandenberg really did do things to that treaty that were quite good, like ensuring that Article 5 or 6, I forget the article, doesn't trigger automatic U.S. troop involvement,
right,
and other things that are quite important for sovereignty. Second question, having read a lot of Senator Taft's writings on NATO and other things, Taft is sort of an intellectual, strange guy in my view. He's kind of odd. He's a good conservative, but he kind of has this sort of contradictory position that he'll take even in one speech. How did Vandenberg work with Taft?
Fascinating question, because you worked with the majority leader, and I think for part of their time together, the Republican majority leader might have been Wallace White. Nobody even remembers Wallace White because Vandenberg was calling the shots on foreign policy, and Taft was calling the shots on domestic policy, and to a certain point they were deferring to each other, and so I think that's curious what your thoughts are, because my impression is that deference on Taft's part carried far enough along to have him agree to the architecture of these post-war structures, but when it came time to funding them, he was also a deficit hawk, and his isolationism would have been expressed in either arguably starving them of funds or just not giving them enough to be as effective as Truman, Atchison, Vandenberg might have thought that it had to be was needed. And so trying to remember, I think Taft supported NATO, but then gave Vandenberg fits on the military assistance plan that would give NATO teeth. And so I think that seems to be the kind of the I don't want to say the game Taft was playing. He may have sincerely believed that these organizations were fine. He just wasn't going to expend too much treasure. And so Vandenberg has a line much earlier in his career when he's resisting some of Roosevelt's stuff, where he talks about the United States should not have unlimited liability for all the costs that are incurred to prop up other countries around the world. We ought to have a limited liability, which I think is a wonderful sort of line. But then Taft would differ with Taft because Taft would limit it even more. And then you argue about, well, would he limit it so much that it wasn't effective? I guess that's how kind of the way I think about it.
Let's go over here.
Thank you, and enjoyed the presentation tremendously, sir. My name is John Gizzi. I'm White House correspondent for Newsmax and adopted Michigander. My wife's from Bay City.
Oh, my gosh.
And just two questions briefly. First, do you see anyone in the Senate today, noted with emphasis on the Republican side, who is a compromiser in the tradition of Arthur Vandenberg. And second, many correspondents I knew who covered Senator Vandenberg, notably Alan Drury, also said that the junior senator from Michigan, Homer Ferguson, was equally bright and ahead of the curve on a lot of things like communist espionage in the United States as well as waste by contractors. Did the two of them get along, and is Ferguson a player in the career of Arthur Vandenberg?
So fun that you should mention him. And Alan Drury, Alan Drury, of course, wrote that wonderful book, Senate Journal, and in where he talks about that, and he talks about, and I think, was it over the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration or something like that, where he said that Vandenberg and Ferguson were the leading voices in the Senate on leading the debate to make it right, in his view. And so Ferguson shows up favorably there. Ferguson served, I think, only one term, and did he serve two? Okay. Okay. So I'm concentrating on the first one because in the second one, Vandenberg dies or is off the scene early in the second one. I think they were very. My impression is that they got along well together. I don't see Ferguson as having been a big influence, and I'm not aware of him showing up much other than in Alan Drury's recollections there, actually, and all the other stuff I've read. But you had a wonderful other earlier observation or question.
Do you see any senator with emphasis
Yeah.
on the Republican side as a compromiser
I mean, that's a dangerous one, of course, but I guess I'd back up, and you're closer to it than I am, but and I'd love Michael's opinion. When the stature of the Senate is not what it was, and so you don't have the institutional platform that a Vandenberg or a Taft had in their day to dominate or set the debate in the same way. I mean, I think I'm thinking of Alan Drury and Advise and Consent, and just such a wonderful book when the Senate could be this center of drama, because what these senators said really mattered, and it doesn't seem to carry that resonance today. And so you've got a combination of, you don't have first of all, it helps if you've got one party in power and the other party in control of the legislature, because that sets up the need for of two partisan voices to figure out how to work together, and then Vandenberg would seem to have had a power. He had the credibility, as I mentioned, in the eyes of a lot of people, of that sinner who becomes the saint, and so that the media elite can love this guy, but he also has great credibility with people who once shared his other views, who he can pull along. And then certainly he had a forceful, powerful personality that, and I don't, it seems like each of those ingredients is missing. And so it may be expecting too much of our senators to try to be able to occupy that space. I don't know how else to answer that. I don't want to start saying, well, gee, Bob Corker couldn't do it and Richard Lugar couldn't do it. What combination of factors there go into that?
When you don't need 2/3 anymore for a treaty agreement, and you have the Iran nuclear deal with Senator Corker agreeing to a setup where you basically need 34 votes to approve it instead of 67, you suddenly don't need a senator like that anymore.
That's true
if you're
too.
an
Yeah.
executive branch.
That's true.
Let's go all the way to the back over there.
Derek Liebart. I'm in the software business. Thanks for a marvelous presentation. Quick question. Can you tell us more about Vandenberg's interaction, perhaps, with Harry Truman during the war and the Truman Committee?
Vandenberg was in the Senate when Truman arrived, and they had they were not real close, but they had a very friendly relationship. In fact, what is it? It was the Lowell B. Mason Marching Society or something. I forget the exact name, but this little fraternity of Senate insiders that would have. Lowell Mason was a guy who had among his many claims to fame, I think he was the attorney for the Washington Senators and had the best box at Griffith Park or something. And so these, each year on opening day, these handful of senators and congressmen would meet in Vandenberg's office, because he was on the first floor of the old Senate office building, and go over to the ballpark. And Vandenberg and Truman had that kind of a relationship. Truman talks about one of his early an appointment to some mid-level maritime commission position or something of somebody he had proposed for the post, must have been Missourian, and Vandenberg rises in the Senate and says, if this is the recommendation of the junior senator from Missouri, I'm all for it. And the little things like that endeared the then more senior Vandenberg to Truman. And then when Roosevelt dies, and Truman, one of Truman's first things to do is to send a box of cigars that had been in the vice president's office in the Capitol that he had occupied to Vandenberg. And then one of his first acts is to call together congressional leaders for lunch the next day. And for Vandenberg, this is like the clouds have parted. Years of Roosevelt's disdain for the senators and lack of inclusion on their part have suddenly come to an end, and Truman is taking comfort in being back among his peeps, so to speak, and Vandenberg is taking comfort that the Senate is once again going to be treated with more respect by the executive. So those are kind of the interactions that stand out in my mind. And Vandenberg, like everybody else, is shocked when Truman is reelected. He's assuming that Tom Dewey is going to be president, and his buddy John Foster Dulles will be Secretary of State if he isn't Secretary of State, and they'll rule the roost. But he has this sort of grudging admiration for Truman having pulled it off, and is ready to give him the benefit of the doubt, thinks that he knows enough about him that Truman will have a challenge, but he can make it work.
Let's go over here, third row in the middle. Yeah. Sorry, do you mind? Sorry.
Hi.
Sorry.
Since you are the sole biographer, is there someone whose biography you would like to read, only no one ever wrote it?
Gosh, what a great question. I almost don't feel well enough read to say that, because I'm trying to figure out what to write next, and I need ideas. I'm wondering about, and I haven't read it because there's one very massive biography of Walter Reuther. But Walter Reuther, one generation later than Vandenberg, is in many ways embodies what might be thought of as the noblest aspects of the labor movement, but also set in place and created a level of prosperity for blue-collar manufacturing in the auto industry that characterized in many ways the golden age of American prosperity. But in that may also have been the seeds of, so Reuther dies in 1970, and how soon after that is it that the shortcomings of the American automobile industry become apparent, and that great industry begins its decline. I don't know if anybody has, and of course Reuther himself, just as Vandenberg makes a big change in his life, Reuther goes from a socialist background, sympathetic to communism, to being one of the founders of the Americans for Democratic Action, and being viewed by many on the left in the labor movement, even as he's doing all these things in civil rights and things that were rather progressive for the George Meanies and a lot of the labor movement, is becoming ardently anti-communist, and that evolution intrigues me. So I don't know. That's my quick off-the-top answer, but I'm sure there's so many others that I should be thinking about. I'd love to hear about them.
I think we have time for probably one more question. Let's go. Sorry, can you wait for the mic?
My name is John Van Tau Sito. My father named me with a half Dutch, half Chinese name. I was brought up in the Dutch Reformed tradition, and I used to make my pilgrimages to Grand Rapids as an elder delegate for the Christian Reformed Church, and I taught at Calvin College. But in listening to your wonderful talk, it stimulated me to think about, I went to Yale University to hear about the Luce family commissioning 2 biographies. One was written by Alan Brinkley, who used to be the provost of Columbia, where I used to be a professor. And I spoke to the Luce grandchildren because I was attending the Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church, where the Luce family was embedded. And I asked them, what do you think about, so I guess, are you people Christians? And they said, oh, we don't buy into that anymore. So the question that I'm asking you, Hank, is, what was there a relationship between Henry Luce and the construction of the Christian century, and also exceptionalism? And another question is, did Vandenberg buy into the notion of a Christian nation, and also the subsequent Vandenberg generations, do they buy into that? And is the present day conservatism, is it totally mimetic of the past, having just been to the Billy Graham Memorial and reflecting on that?
Oh, well, I don't know if I can take on all of that, but
Let's do the Vandenberg part.
Right. Well, so Vandenberg was a Congregationalist, and when he was in the Senate, when he was presiding over the Senate as President pro tem, his daily interaction was with the Senate chaplain at that time, who was only there briefly before he died quite young, and that was Peter Marshall. And for those of you who haven't heard, the man called Peter, he was very prominent preacher of his time. I mean, mentioning Billy Graham, it would have been interesting to see how Peter Marshall's career evolved, because he was a very charismatic Presbyterian. But he and Vandenberg would sit down each day before the opening session and look over what was going on, and Marshall would give the opening prayer, and sometimes reflecting on the issues of the day in very telling or moving ways. And Vandenberg called him Domini, which is the Dutch name for a minister. And then with the Luce family, Vandenberg and Henry Luce came to be somewhat political allies. They were never close, although there was some suspicion that had Vandenberg ever become president, he would make Henry Luce his Secretary of State. Nothing got serious enough to worry about that, whether that was anything remotely true. And really, John Foster Dulles was his good friend and would have been. But Clare Booth Luce and Vandenberg became very close, and to the point where Vandenberg's daughter worried that in her own passionate conversion to Catholicism, when Vandenberg was dying, she might try to convert him, which she never did. But at the 1948 convention, she was pleading with him to actually aggressively pursue the presidency, and she was a big admirer of his. And one of the last letters that he wrote was, as he was dying, was to her. And so they were, she had a rather checkered life, so I have to be careful how I phrase this. They were very close friends, not in a way that would be, could be otherwise construed. But he writes to her about, as he's dying, about having a little, I forget how he describes it more eloquently, but I have a little prayer meeting of my own every night. And this is Vandenberg writing to Clare Booth Luce. So they had a a very sort of a spiritual relationship that way.
Excellent. Michael wants to add one last quick question.
Well, I read one paragraph in your book, sort of sent a chill up my spine, and I wanted to ask a question to you about it. When Vandenberg had last met with Franklin Roosevelt on the eve of the president's departure for Warm Springs, where he died, a copy of his famous speech of January 10th, 1945, lay amid the clutter on the Oval Office desk. One passage was underlined. If World War III unhappily arrives, it will open new laboratories of death too horrible to contemplate. The president had nodded toward the text. Senator, he said, you have no idea how right you are, but I think you'll discover that before the year is out. Had Roosevelt started to trust Vandenberg?
Well, I don't know if he had to trust him or if he's just, not teasing him in a serious way, but this, of course, is Vandenberg. Roosevelt's talking about the Manhattan Project in April of 45, and
Vandenberg did not know about it.
No, he did not. And so but neither did Truman or many other people. But that's certainly what it seems like he must have been alluding to.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, for the discussion. We're going to do 10 minutes of book signing, and then,
well, thank you all
use
very
the
much.
opportunity.
Appreciate your questions. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.